Next, I want to talk with you about balance sheets and how they represent the claims that others have on financial institutions and the claims that financial institutions have on others. There's a simple graphical way to represent, for example, a bank balance sheet. We start with some assets, and these assets are claims that the bank has on others, and they are financed by liabilities, claims that others have on the bank. Now, a balance sheet is called a balance sheet because the asset and the liability side have to balance. So the best way to draw them is to draw them like a little rectangle box. So the different assets that a bank has are mainly loans. Then there are some bonds. Some securities. And these are other securities. So these are, for example, equities or derivatives. And then there are some interbank claims. So let's just write this as interbank. The bank finances all these activities mostly through deposits, which are from households. They also issue bonds themselves. So here we have some bonds. And since banks lend to one another, some of the banks have to actually borrow from other banks. So here's some interbank liabilities. The difference between the asset and the liability side, by definition, is called the bank capital. Now, this capital is usually held in the form of equity. So the bank issues stock, and households, for example, invest in the stock of this bank. And there are some rules for how much capital a bank must have, and we will revisit these rules later. So this is the very basic bank balance sheet. We can dig a little deeper, for example, when we split the deposits into some long-term deposits. Let's start with the short-term deposits. And some of the deposits will be long-term. Short-term deposits are, for example, call deposits. So these are your normal checkings account where you can redeem your money within a day's notice. Long-term deposits are things like term deposits that have a maturity of a year or sometimes even 5 years, where you would have to pay a high penalty if you want to redeem them at short notice. So there are some short-term and some long-term deposits. Loans usually have always a long maturity, and these loans are to either households or to firms. By far the biggest chunk of loans to households are mortgages. They have a very long maturity, but loans to firms are usually larger than loans to households in total. It depends a bit on the country. In the US, for example, household loans are much, much larger than firm loans. So this is the basic bank balance sheet. For asset managers, it looks slightly different, but similar. So if we want to look at the balance sheet for an asset manager, we again have assets and liabilities. But since asset managers are a bit smaller on average than banks, we draw their little rectangular box a little smaller. And we also divide between the asset side and the liability side. On the liability side, asset managers have mostly shares. So these are similar to deposits in that households hold them and they are very short term, but they don't have the exact same characteristic of deposits. Asset managers use these shares and invest into bonds and equities. Now you'll note that asset managers don't have capital. That is because their regulation works different than the regulation for banks. For asset managers, the rule is that they have a net value of only $1, and they try to keep this constant by adjusting their asset side. And mechanically, the price of the shares always reflects this asset size. So if the share price of an asset manager drops, then your shares are worth less, and basically you face some risk, while if you have deposits, they are usually insured, and you face no risk at all. So these are the two most important financial intermediaries that we will revisit throughout the course. Hedge funds are very similar to how asset managers work, except that they are more active on their asset side, and they rebalance their asset side more often.